who unfortunately could not be there themselves, but we're very grateful that we can do this. The workshop today surrounds the theme of transformation in forest policy. And to discuss this complex and interesting topic, we have Professor Dr. Giessen of the TU Dresden joining us online, who was also with us in Taran already. Yes, so please give him a warm welcome, as well as our partners Forest Europe, EFI, FSC, ANB, STB, and GLS, or Cyborg EPLA. Yeah, so thank you so much for being here. And after this keynote, we will have a coffee break and start with the first session of the World Café, which I will explain.
You can start whenever you want.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Usually I start after I have been prompted by the moderator, but it's difficult for me to hear your audio. So please bear with me. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lukas Giessen from TU Dresden. I'm the chair of Tropical and International Forestry and Forest Governance here. And some of you, or I suppose most of you, have met me during the excursion and during the visit to our Tarant campus last week. So I was requested to give you, or asked to give you, a short introduction into the topic of today's workshop, forest policy transformations in a nutshell. And I titled my talk here Forest Policy and Governance, because I want to give you a perspective on what is forest policy, but also how does policy happen in a broader governance context. So I will go from some dry concepts, and you will during the day hear much more interesting and much more lively and vivid contributions from my colleagues in Bonn, from FSC and some German forestry or forest protection associations, and from the Forest Europe and so on. But you will have to bear with me to get some dry slides in the beginning. So conceptualizing means for us, what is it? How can we define? How can we understand the concept of forest policy? First and foremost, I think we have to be aware that the political, so everything that is concerned with the political, addresses issues of common concern. And an issue of common concern can, in a lecture hall, for example, be the room temperature during a lecture, which might be too high for some and too low for others, hence being made an issue between those who perceive it as too warm or too cold. So in a lot of cultures, we have policy and politics up there. This I have to stop your imagination. Policy is really everything that concerns all of us. But in English language, we would have three components of this political. We would have a polity, so the fundamental context and structures which are provided for dealing with issues of common concern, mostly provided by our constitutions, where is written who is mandated to do what. Then we do have politics, which is the process of dealing with these issues of common concern. Usually this is the conflictual way and struggle amongst different actors to deal with these issues of common concern, which then might result in a third component in policy, which then is the content of dealing with issues of common concern. So something like a plan of action of how to deal with these issues of common concern. If we ask ourselves, how can we define policy? We first have to make sure that we talk about public policy and not a company, a private enterprise policy. But any policy then is a deliberate, intentional plan and course of action. So deliberate, intentional on the one hand, but a plan of action that is formulated for achieving some rational outcomes. It consists of some formulation phase and some implementation phase, and usually a policy is pursued by an individual or an organization. Here in this figure, you see some scholars talk about a policy cycle where you start with strategic thinking, then develop the policy, implement a policy, and maintain or revise a certain policy with different particular steps. I think if we ask ourselves, and this is something you will not hear so much in the more lively presentations from my colleagues from the practice field, in forest policy practice, you will not hear these conceptual terms so much, but I think I need to at least make you aware that if we consider policy as a plan and course of action, then we should ask ourselves, of which elements does this consist of? And classically, firstly, a policy addresses a certain issue or makes something, some existing real-world problem, makes it a political issue and states this problem is to be addressed. And a second component of public policies then usually are policy goals, so the ends towards which this policy wants to develop reality and change the problem or the issue. Then usually a policy names some instruments or the means of policy through which it wants to achieve these goals. And classically, we distinguish four of them: regulatory instruments, economic instruments, informational instruments, and procedural or cooperative policy instruments. Yes, and the fourth component of a public policy are then the provisions for implementation, which basically relates to applying the instruments. It usually talks to who are the mandated responsible actors to implement, which procedures are established, which resources are available for those means, and which institutional backup is provided by different ministries and so forth. So if we look into detail into the policy instruments that we have, I introduced to you four of them. So the regulatory policy instruments are those political interventions which aim to change behavior of people, of addressees, through binding and enforceable regulation. And enforceable means as a last resort through means of physical force or of violence, stating that a regulator, a state, can enforce regulations also against the will and also using as a last resort measure physical force. Economic instruments would then change behavior based on transfer of economic values, whereas informational instruments would change behavior through the provision of information. And the last one, I'm sorry, here it got deleted. Procedural instruments aim to change behavior through the provision of procedures and structures. So if we now apply this definition of public policies to the field of forests and forest policy, then there are different ways of classifying different policies and making them distinct from forest policies. And this figure now gives you an idea of how we can thematically sort or have a typology of policies and of forest policies. So if we look at the universe of all existing policies, there are these policies which do not address forests formally. So who do not claim in their documents, in writing, that the policy addresses forests. However, we all know that a lot of infrastructure policies do have implications for forests, because the highway that is built needs to be somewhere. And often this is in forests. So if forests are not formally addressed, but still this policy is empirical relevant for forests, then we would call it a forest relevant policy. So you see this to the right, to the upper right. So we would call it a forest relevant policy because it's relevant for forests. However, if a certain policy addresses forests as a formal issue and writes inside the policy, our goal is to increase forests or to combat deforestation or to reduce emissions from deforestation, then this policy formally addresses forests, and then we can still distinguish those two types. Either they address forests formally as a primary issue, as the main problem to be addressed, or as a secondary, as a non-primary issue. And this we would then call forest-related policies or forest-focused policies, respectively. But of course, we can also distinguish forest policies according to geographical scope. So we can ask at subnational level, national levels, international levels of regional or global scope to address forests. And this is oftentimes a confusion, a single new program that is just issued by the government or by the Federal Ministry of Agriculture, a single new program might be considered a policy, a new policy. However, it only adds part to the already existing comprehensive sectoral policy. So this is there the term of public policy is not so sharp yet and oftentimes confused. So if we look at forest policies, then at least in my institute, and in our research, we take an actor-centered perspective on public policy, on public forest policy, because this we also deem the main drivers behind policy. So policy is not mainly driven by rules or by what we have to do, but it's mainly driven by people, by groups, by organizations saying what they want to achieve, and hence what type of rules and regulations we would need. And I think the following graph shows you already that the forests we have nowadays are populated by a number of different and very colorful different interests from different societal groups, which we refer to as actors or stakeholders. And to give you a definition of what we understand as a policy actor would be any human entity that has a distinct interest on the one hand and the possibility of influencing a policy. So someone who has a distinct interest, a real interest, and the possibility to influence a policy, we would consider a policy actor. However, if someone only has a distinct interest, and with interest we mean here the benefits, the material and immaterial benefits someone can receive from a certain object. If someone only has this interest, but not the possibility of influencing a policy, then we would consider this person or this group or this organization a stakeholder. So if we now ask how to best pursue one's interests, what would be good to have in order to effectively pursue such an interest, we come to that conclusion that you need the possibility of influencing a policy. And in our world, we would translate this into the term power, or into the concept of power. So power, not electricity power, but power in terms of the strength of a certain actor. And this is here to the right side. You see a A1 and A2, actor 1 and actor 2 figure, which should illustrate to you how we look at actors. We look at actors who have interests and power, so the possibility to influence a policy. And we would assume that we would depict an actor as a vector here, as an arrow, and the direction of this arrow would be the interest, whereas the length of this arrow would resemble the power. So the more power, the higher is the possibility to pursue someone's interests further. So power we try to conceptualize, or we try to make visible, because our study subject, usually policy makers, policy addressees, stakeholders and actors, they are usually not so much willing to disclose everything, right? So if we would measure tree height or tree growth, it is more easy to tape measure length and height. But with humans and organizations, it is not exactly so easy. So we distinguish three types of empirically observable power capabilities, which in the first place is coercion through the use or the threat of using physical force. A second one are incentives or disincentives, which function as advantages or disadvantages for someone. And the third one is dominant information, which is information which for the other side is not verifiable. But you should know that power, especially the use of force, is usually not exercised, is not often exercised. Oftentimes this power is works through the threat, through the announcement of I could use that physical force, I could give you a disadvantage, or I could give you some beneficial information. This is important to know in these power questions. So if we look at the type of forest policy actors, we do look at different, this is a typology. So classically it is government and its administrations. So please do not only say the government, but also say which administration. So for example, forest administrations, state forest services, such as the Bundesforst or the federal government forest service, who is hosting you this morning, I learned, agricultural administrations, environmental administrations, and ministries, and you name it. From our own research, we could now say also foreign donors, donor bureaucracies, and international banks could also be subsumed here. Secondly, we have political parties. I think in most of your countries, you have different types of parties. One particularity would be one-party systems, which we just are about to work out in a PhD project here in China. And then very importantly, and you have 2 or 3 associations, also known as NGOs or organized interest groups, from different fields. For example, from forestry, forest owners, forest workers associations, but also forest nature conservation and forest conservation or environmental protection associations, as well as wood processing industries and so on, hunting associations, beekeeping, hiking, biking, horseback riding, you name it. And lastly, you have forest users, individual forest users, such as private forest owners, forest workers, and the general public. So if now you got an overview, at least a conception of what is public forest policy, what is forest policy. And in a lot of cases nowadays, you will hear the term forest governance somehow in relation to that forest policy questions and so on. Some use it synonymously, but I do not. I would claim that forest governance is a broader process, and forest policy is a component of it. So governance is not really a theory for explaining some outcomes, but it is rather a perspective of what to look at. And what to look at, to me, governance is societal steering. So how to steer, how to govern society through formal and informal economic, policy, political, legal, sociological, and anthropological factors. So everything that somehow relates to humans. So if we look at this equation, to me, the yellow on the top, forest governance, would be all institutions, rules and rule systems, plus actors leading to effects on forests. This would be my equation, what forest governance is. So all institutions and rule systems, including policies, including regulations, plus the actors who have certain interests and power, leading to effects in either biophysical or social systems. To me, this would be forest governance, but this is also debatable. Well, and if now we look at forest policies, at specific forest policies, I think it would be pointless to introduce you now to a specific national or subnational forest policy. I think for your host country, Germany, you will hear a lot of things. 2 things or 3 things I want to give you in advance on the German forest policy setting. You have to know that Germany is a federal country. That means after World War II, it was decided that no whatsoever central strong power should emerge again, but Germany should be kept into a number of federal states, or Länder in our language, so provinces. And we do have 16 Länder or 16 federal states, which together make the Federal Republic of Germany, or the Germany as a whole. And in this federal polity, in this federal setting, all forest management, forest and nature conservation competencies rest with the federal states and not with the central government. So this is where you will see today that yes, at national level, we do have some activities with particular regarding international forest policies and the representation of Germany in these international processes. But the technical policy on forest management is the responsibility of the provinces, of the federal states. This is the one pre-mention I want to make. The second one is that in Germany, forests are owned by people or organizations. So unlike in a lot of global South countries, or unlike in a lot of Eastern European, Central Asian, and former Soviet Union states, we do have a big chunk of privately owned forests. And this is not only tenure rights or using rights, like in many countries of the global South. This is really titled ownership. And this comes from a long history of French Revolution and so on. It would go too far, but it is an extremely strong, protected by all constitutions in Europe, strong right of private people and private companies to own and to be entitled to own land. So this in Germany is roughly 50%, a little bit less, then 50% is owned privately of the forest area. And the other part is either state-owned by the different federal states or by the national central government, just like the Central Forest Service that is hosting you, or is owned by municipalities, church, and other big organizations. So this is the two things I want to tell you about German forest policy that you will dive in much more in detail later. But now getting from this German example as your host country into something that is more relevant for all of you is international forest policies. And for international forest policies, you have to be aware of some specificities of international policy. So you do not have any clear polity in the international system. There is no central government, there is no central authority, there is no global police, and so forth. So there are no clear structures. And those few structures which are provided for political cooperation, they are provided by international regimes or by international agreements or by international treaties. And this is what we call international law. And for the Germans amongst you, this is what we call Völkerrecht. So the binding structures established by international treaties. And now we ask, where does policy come from in this international sphere? So policy is then developed within those regime structures. So within these this polity, some policies are then developed. So we end up having both a structure of a regime and a policy of an international regime. Now, if we look at the forest case, and this is only a schematic thing with a lot of acronyms. So at global level, we will find something that we call a forest regime complex. So this is a puzzle put together by many pieces. We have some circles here. For example, the United Nations CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. And each of these circle regimes might have some provisions, ideas, or goals for forests. And taken together from all different international regimes, those forest elements makes then up this international forest regime complex, a loosely coupled specialized regimes that are loosely linked together, sometimes reinforcing each other, but at other times overlapping and conflicting. And this is only a schematic sketch. If you empirically look at how does the global forest regime complex look like, you will find some 42 or what elements. You will not have to know all these acronyms. This is only to show you the plethora, the big amount of international treaties, conventions, programs that exist, which all want something from forests. And if we now combine them and cluster all these circles here, you will get a clearer picture. You will get a picture that there are certain main clusters, for example, from the field of biodiversity on the top left, or trade on the top, on the left bottom, or human rights from the field of climate change and the field of sustainable development. A lot of claims come towards forests. You should know timber is the biggest traded asset in volume terms worldwide. And all these claims come towards forests, including, of course, also at the core, these forest and forest management regimes and policies. So, from science, the main characteristics of this international forest regime complex is that it is institutionally very fragmented. Some claim it is ineffective. Some even claim it is failed, but they all are missing saying failed against which aim. So if you do not really formulate a central aim or goal to achieve, it is, from my perspective, very difficult to say something is ineffective or even failed. But I think what we can claim is that this regime is to a large extent relatively hollow, consciously left open, what others name a non-regime. So something that is there just to be there, to prevent meaningful regulation from other sides. And I think with this, let me check, I would come to my last point and then conclude. If you look at this international policies, this big amount, and some of you might find a job then in the FAO or UNFF or RED Plus processes and so forth, then if you want to transform some of these policies, what would you need? When would you do it and how would you do it? So the first message I want to send you before concluding is you need to be courageous to identify policy space. There are many people out there who say, no, the regulation is like this, I have to follow this procedure, full stop. But in our changing world, we have changing problems. And if then following old established rules is our main answer, then we might be a little bit lost. So finding the courage to stand up and to make a meaningful contribution and say we need to change a certain procedure in order to address current problems more effectively. This is what it takes from the young generation. Yes, and then secondly, at which stage in the policy process? By framing a certain problem, putting an issue onto political agendas, you will see this is a lot of work. Framing something as a problem, not only naming it, but framing it and making it a political issue is a hell a lot of work. And then formulating policy goals, instruments, and provisions for implementation is a technical, more or less a technical exercise. And then you will see a lot of you will also implement policies later on, either as employee in a lead agency, in a lead ministry, in a lead agency, or in an assisting agency, a secondary one, or in associations and NGOs who hold a lot of information which state agencies often do not have. Yes, and then the question is, how do you transform? What is needed? Of course, some sort of a mandate. But would you also need a loud voice? So this might be one strategy, yeah, like Greta Thunberg, just being very stubborn, sitting in front of the parliament, or going protesting with loud voices. But this all does not help if you do not have technical information, if you do not have expertise that really counts and is not only blah, 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 hot air. Of course, then you will also need resources to transform. And essentially, it all leads to you need certain power capabilities in order to transform forest policies towards certain ends. Two things to consider, and then I will close. One thing is, do not only consider a single policy, but also consider, if you transform something, how does this resonate in the broader forest governance setting with other sectoral policies, with the informal interests and the informal goals behind that you cannot see in the first place. And the second thing is, be a little bit aware and explicit in which direction you want to transform things. Because transformation for its own sake, I would say is nothing. You need to have a good idea towards what you want to transform things, to make them explicit in order to win coalition partners who support you, but also to identify political opponents, which then automatically come once you say towards which direction you want to transform things. With this, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to address your questions if time allows and if moderator allows. Thank you very much.
Is it working? Hello?
Yes, I do hear you.
Oh. Oh, it's online. Ah, okay. Can I also speak? Okay, yeah, it's fine. Thank you very much, Herr Giessen. Unfortunately, we do not have time for questions as we're already a bit late on our time schedule. This is not working either. But yes, thank you very much. I think this was a great insight into this topic and will serve as a really good basis for our discussions. And we will now have a coffee break for 20 minutes until 10:45. So back there you can get some coffee and some snacks. Yes, please give a very big round of applause for Lukas Giessen.